Have you ever wondered why some people seem to have a really great memory, while others struggle to remember their friend's birthday or their neighbor's name, or even where they put their keys?
So there's been this fascination ever since people started studying the mind, this fascination in understanding why is it that we can't think about everything at once? Why is there a limit to the scope of our conscious awareness?
That's Edward Awh, professor of psychology at the University of Chicago, where he co-directs a neuroscience lab along with his colleague, Ed Vogel. Their research examines how the brain controls focus, memory, and attention.
It seems like our conscious awareness is actually, interestingly, quite limited, despite our subjective impression that we're taking in a huge amount of information at any given moment in time.
Even in today's world, where it feels like we're overloaded with information, from social media to the news to the text messages on our phones, Awh says there's only so much information that our brains can actually store.
And there's some fascinating work that suggests that if you try to measure the maximum amount of information that people can hold in mind at one time, it turns out to be very similar across people who have excellent performance and people who have not so good performance. And what really distinguishes the high performers from the others is the consistency with which they are able to load information into memory.
But being a high performer or having a so-called good memory doesn't actually reflect how intelligent you are or even how studious you are. It might just have to do with one single trait.
And it's interesting that this ability is a very stable trait of an individual. If we measure your working memory capacity today, we're going to find a very similar measurement a year from now or 6 months from now.
We all want to be more productive, whether in our personal lives or at work. So, is there a life hack that we can use to actually control our attention?
Use the remote control of your mind to decide on which aspects of a complex environment that you're going to focus your attention on, and thereby control which things are going to occupy your really limited space in working memory.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, welcome to Big Brains, where we explore the groundbreaking research and the discoveries that are changing our world. I'm your host, Paul Rand. Join me as we meet the minds behind the breakthroughs. On today's episode, the science behind our memory and attention. Today's episode of Big Brains is supported by the Court Theater, Hyde Park's Tony Award-winning theater located on the University of Chicago campus. Here, timeless stories speak to today's world. From Sophocles to Tom Stoppard, Carol Churchill to Anton Chekhov, and August Wilson to Tennessee Williams. When you're at Court Theater, you know you're going to see something bold and provocative, something that will move you and make you think. You know you're going to get a great theatrical experience unlike anything else, one that only could happen on the south side of Chicago. Reimagine what classic theater can be. Visit Court Theater, that's Court, TheaTre.org. Well, I wonder if we can just start off right at the beginning for you and tell me what your research is focused on and what problems are you trying to understand about the human mind?
Yes, so we have a cognitive neuroscience laboratory here, and so we're interested in understanding with brain and behavior how the mind works. And one of our key focuses in our lab is the idea of attention and working memory. We see these as very intertwined ideas, with attention referring to an observer's ability to determine which aspects of a really busy environment they're actually focusing their mind on. And working memory refers to their ability to maintain that information even if it's not present any longer in the environment. And what we're trying to understand is the sharp capacity limits that have been seen in working memory. It seems like our conscious awareness is actually interestingly quite limited, despite our subjective impression that we're taking in a huge amount of information at any given moment in time. And we try to combine those types of information to understand why memory and attention are limited and what the consequences of those limits might be.
And when you talk about working memory, can you explain how that fits into the other types of memory, please?
When I refer to working memory, what I mean are the memories or the thoughts that are currently in mind, the ones that you're currently thinking about and aware of. And we could contrast that with long term memory, which refers to all of the memories and experiences that you have stored over your lifetime in your brain. And we know that we can retrieve those long term memories in a fairly amazing and efficient way. But the ones that are actually on stage in your mind, those are the ones that we're referring to as working memories.
And when did we start first understanding that the brain actually had limits?
So there's been this fascination ever since people started studying the mind, this fascination in understanding why is it that we can't think about everything at once? Why is there a limit to the scope of our conscious awareness? Now, in modern literature, I would actually point to a really seminal study that was done by Steve Luck and Ed Vogel, where they asked this question about the scope of working memory, but they did so in this really clever way where they used extremely simple stimuli, just
Hmm.
colored squares, nothing more. It was the simplest objects that one could conceive of. And they came up with an objective method for just measuring how many simple colors can an individual hold in mind at one time. So now there's no debate about whether each object is an object or whether they're too complex to take in. They were as simple as possible. And yet, despite the simplicity of the objects, the apparent capacity was only about 3 or 4 of these simple colors.
Got
And
it.
this really comes as a surprise to most people whose intuitions are that they can have a much richer and vaster landscape that they're thinking about at any given moment. And I think that this study it's been cited many, many thousands of times because it really captured the field's imagination to try to understand why the limit is so short.
And once it was understood that there is a limit, did we get around to asking, well, why? Why can we only hold such a small amount of information?
Yes, I think that this is kind of the million-dollar question, Paul.
Yeah.
Why is there this limit? And I think that, there's a long history here and the history of the neuroscience of looking at short-term memory function. Um, about 50 years ago or so in the 70s, people started to find neural signals that would actually track the content of the information that an animal was holding in working memory, for example. Like if a monkey was holding a color in short-term memory, they could actually find cells in the inferotemporal cortex that would represent that color during that delay period. And there was kind of this real excitement about this type of observation because it seemed like neuroscientists were able to be looking at the memories as they were being held online in this neural activity. And so this really inspired a lot of theories of working memory limits that focus on limits in those brain regions that are representing the information of interest. So color selective neurons in the visual cortex or face selective cells in the inferotemporal cortex. Perhaps these are the places where these capacity limits are actually arising. But I will point out that Ed Vogel and I actually have a kind of different perspective on these
Okay.
capacity limits. And instead, we've kind of been focused on the idea of a limit in a process that is actually separate, a distinct facet of memory from the maintenance of specific pieces of content per se. And so if you'll give me a moment, I can try to
Please,
explain
go
what I'm
for it.
talking about here. So if you think about your everyday experience in life, almost every experience that you have is in a dynamic environment. Even just
Okay.
reaching out to pick up a coffee cup. Well, what you're having to do is track your fingers and your hand and the position of that cup simultaneously as you bring them together and then you lift it to your mouth and take a sip. And what we're realizing through kind of visual cognition and the philosophy of visual cognition is that this simple act of picking up an object or targeting an object, acting upon an object, even touching an object, requires you to be able to track that object through time and space. In other
Okay.
words, we would call this in more jargony terms, refer to this as context binding. How do you
Okay.
actually take an object that you're interested in and perceive it within the context of a dynamic event? And what we think we've been able to find is a neural signal that actually tracks the number of items that a person is currently binding to the event that they are perceiving. And so, for example, in that simple colored square memory task that I was just mentioning to you, if we vary the number of colors that a person is holding in working memory, we can see a sustained neural signal that will actually tell us how many individual colors are they able to hold in mind at one time.
Huh.
But a really fascinating thing about that neural signal is that it is general and does not seem to care too much about what the content is of the items that are being maintained in memory. So, for example, we in a recent paper found that if you look at the neural activity that tracks the number of colors that a person is holding in memory, we see that a very similar, if not identical, neural signal is generated when people are holding different numbers of sounds in working memory as
Okay.
well. So even
Interesting.
though they're separate sensory modalities, there
It's the
appears to
same.
be kind of a unified system for tracking the number of items that are currently being attended or held in mind.
So help me understand this. We've all, some more recently than others, have played the memory game. There's always somebody at the table that blows everybody away and can remember multiple numbers of things. Are they special? Are they exercise their memory in different ways? What constitutes the differences in human performance like this?
Yes. Well, I think there's two interesting answers to this question. First, we could talk about the normal variation in human memory ability. So, if we measure working memory capacity across a large group of people, we will find a pretty wide distribution of abilities across people. Some people are very good at these memory tasks, and other people are not so good. And it's interesting that this ability is a very stable trait of an individual. If we
Okay.
measure your working memory capacity today, we're going to find a very similar measurement a year from now or 6 months from now. It seems to be kind of a trait-like aspect of cognitive ability. Um, Now, you might ask, why are some people better and some people worse? And an intuitive explanation is to say that, well, people with better memory simply have more space in their
Okay.
working memory. They have room for a larger amount of information. But I think this turns out to be an incorrect intuition. And there's some fascinating work that suggests that if you try to measure the maximum amount of information that people can hold in mind at one time, it turns out to be very similar across people who have excellent performance and people who have not so good performance. And what really distinguishes the high performers from the others is the consistency with which they are able to load information into memory.
What do you
So,
mean
for
by that?
example, perhaps what you'd find is that in a group of 100 subjects, the vast majority of people will have a top limit of about 3 items that they could hold in memory at a time. But what you'll see is that some subjects accomplish that nearly every time that they try, and other subjects only rarely get to that maximum limit. So there's something about consistency and attentional focus that is providing an advantage to some people, and it does so in this very consistent and reliable way across many different contexts.
Now, your research also has shown that when cognitive loads increase, the brain doesn't just slow down, but it actually drops information. And I think this gets to where it starts, to me, starts getting particular interest. How do you know that?
Well, there's 2 ways we can demonstrate this fascinating fact. One of them is we simply use behavioral measurements to objectively measure how many things a person can reliably report from a display that has varying numbers of targets. So perhaps we could vary it from one item all the way up to 8 items. 8 items being well beyond the typical capacity of a human observer. And what we'll see is that as we count up the number of items that are actually held in mind, 1, 2, 3, we see a rise from 1 to 2 to 3. But then actually as we go beyond 3 items, we'll see that their ability to report that information actually declines, so that with 6 items, they can report fewer things back to you than they could with 3 items. Even though they had more things that they had the opportunity to report, it's as though they drop that information when their memory system is overloaded.
Got it.
One interesting fact is that this tendency to drop information with overload is much more pronounced in individuals who have lower memory ability. So this is one of the things that actually distinguishes the high from the low performers.
Okay. Now, you have used, as you mentioned, EEGs to identify some neural markers that talk about and predict when attention's about to fail. What are you seeing in the brain at that moment? And is that addressable?
Well, so yes, I mentioned that we can look at EEG activity, which will provide us a pretty precise and time-resolved measure of how many things a person is thinking about. And if we go back to your question about overload, if we continue to look at that neural activity as we vary the number of items that a person is trying to take in and report, we'll see that neural signatures of storage actually also decline as you're going to higher and higher loads. And this actually is a pretty good predictor of which subjects will also show a decline in their behavioral performance. Now, another kind of neural signal that you can look at is ongoing activity, rhythmic brain activity, looking at activity in different frequency bands. And Ed Vogel has found in the past that certain frequencies of activity in the beta range of the frequencies will actually be predictive of when individuals are likely to experience a drop of information during an upcoming trial of the experiment. So by scrutinizing these types of brain signals, you actually can see a little bit of a prediction of the future of how likely it is that somebody's going to be dropping information. And this raises the exciting idea that perhaps we could use that type of neural activity to try to minimize those kinds of errors.
Yes.
If it were possible to measure it in real time and thus prepare somebody for the likelihood that they're about to make that kind of error, that would be a really fascinating way to try to boost people's performance, even if we're not increasing their native capacity.
Have our brains evolved over time with the amount of new inflows that are coming into it? Or have they stayed relatively consistent, but we've had to figure out how to manage the capacities that are innate to us?
I think that I would lean towards the latter perspective, that,
Okay.
If we look at measurements of human memory performance, for example, over the last century, there's a fascinating study that I talk about in class by a man named Jevons, who measured his memory capacity over 120 years ago at about 4 items. And we see very similar limits today in modern subjects using modern methods. And if we, we can kind of look at that trajectory of performance across many decades, where there's actually been a fairly massive change in the density and amount of media information and the complexity of our environments with industrialization. And there's no real compelling evidence that our mental faculties have changed in some fundamental way due to these really dramatic changes in the information load of our environments.
If you're getting a lot out of the important research that's shared on Big Brains, there's another University of Chicago Podcast Network show that you should check out. It's called Capital Isn't. Capital Isn't uses the latest economic thinking to zero in on the ways that capitalism is, and more often isn't, working today. From the debate over how to distribute a vaccine to the morality of a wealth tax, Capitalism clearly explains how capitalism can go wrong and what we can do about it. Listen to Capitalism, part of the University of Chicago podcast network. If what we're being told is that the brain is not necessarily evolving to process additional information, that gives us a pretty huge insight about how this new world that we're going into, that we've been in, but even more importantly, what we're going into, how we ought to be thinking about it, doesn't it?
Yes, and certainly it shows that there's a premium on our ability to take these limited cognitive resources that we have and to distribute them wisely, to apply them to exactly the right aspects, the most relevant aspects of our busy environment.
Okay. Based on your research, can you talk about what kind of people, what kind of minds function better in complex, information-rich environments, and why is it they're able to do so?
So again, here I would return to this fundamental ability to use the remote control of your mind, to decide on which aspects of a complex environment that you're going to focus your attention on, and thereby control which things are going to occupy your really limited space in working memory. So the individuals that tend to succeed in complex environments are the ones who can take their goal for that particular event or task and use it to voluntarily control which aspect of the environment they're currently focusing their mind on. This determines which aspect of the environment will then enter into their working memory, and that is the online workspace of our ability to reason and solve problems.
And do people have that innately, or have they learned how to do that better?
I think that it is a fundamentally innate process. That is, it seems as though people have a certain level of ability to focus their attention. It doesn't seem as though it's that amenable to training or change.
Okay. Huh.
And that it really seems to be a stable trait of the individual, with the exception that there are ways to damage your natural capacity. For example, if you are malnourished, or if you have extended periods of stress or anxiety, we know that these types of things can undermine your ability to achieve the potential that you have. So if we have a child who has lived in a malnourished or stressful environment, and we're able to bring them into a more nurturing environment where they are well fed, well, it turns out that their cognitive capacities will improve. And likewise, there is one thing that we can do that I am convinced actually
I'm all
does
ears.
have measurable effects on memory and attention function, and that is exercise.